All right, hello. Thank you all for coming. It's great to see such a wonderful turnout, and thank you to those of you online. I'm William Paris. I'm the project director of the Race, Ethics, and Power Project within the Center for Ethics, and it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Melvin Rogers from Brown University. Melvin Rogers is the Edna and Richard Salomon Distinguished Professional Scholar and stands as a distinguished academic renowned for his insightful contributions to the discourse on race and democracy within the realms of American culture and politics. His writings include The Darkened Light of Faith, Race, Democracy, and Freedom in African American Political Thought, which I believe today's talk will be based on the chapter. African American Political Thought, A Collective History. If you don't own that, you should get it. It is a fantastic collection on people from Delaney to Zora Neale Hurston. It's great. The Undiscovered Dewey, Religion, Morality, and Ethos of Democracy. And these works carefully examine the philosophical and cultural resources of America's past to grapple with the problems of race, the dangers to democratic life, and the crisis of character. In doing so, he stands in the grand tradition of philosophical reflection and cultural criticism that we find in Frederick Douglass, John Dewey, W.E.B. Du Bois, and James Baldwin. Today's talk is called On James Baldwin, History, Responsibility, and Atonement. So please join me in welcoming Professor Rogers.
Well, first of all, I want to thank William for the introduction, but really for the invitation. I've never been to the University of Toronto, and so I've been walking around today, and it's quite beautiful. And it's nice to feel the energy of the city. So thank you, William, for that opportunity. I want to thank all of you for being here. And of course, whenever we have events like this, there's always invisible labor that makes these things possible. So I want to say thank you to them as well. So let me jump into this, and I will, just because it's the nature of my habits, I will check on you all periodically. All right. So I find myself these days, more so than usual, pessimistic about the future of the United States. I suppose I'm not alone. The currents of Trumpism have seized the nation, and we in the United States still seem ill-prepared to handle it, in part because we speak about our moment, our political moment, in terms of democratic partisan politics or polarization. In one of its forms, Trumpism is simply racial resentment. It is a sense that racial progress comes at the expense of white Americans, that racial progress isn't about redeeming society, but reinscribing harms now directed toward white Americans. There's more to Trumpism than this, to be sure. But one response we see today is not to confront the racial past of the United States, but to deny it. Americans refuse to acknowledge, as Abraham Lincoln thought, that we cannot escape history. I've been looking for resources that can help me understand not so much Trumpism, but our tendency in the United States, whether one is on the political right or left, to seek racial redemption through politics. This tendency of ours in the United States is dangerous. Even among the best of us, the tendency gets in the way of us doing right by justice, by democracy's demand that we honor the freedom and equal standing of our fellows. Our illusions and evasions, the false safety that comes with the assertion of our specialness or our idolatrous elevation of the purity of the past that never existed, will always present our vices as virtues, and in doing so, deform both us and the United States. It's in this context that I turn to two figures: the Swedish sociologist Gunnar Myrdal and the American novelist and essayist James Baldwin. And I'll say more about them in a moment. In turning to Gunnar Myrdal, I want to understand a kind of racial liberalism that defined the second half of the 20th century in the United States, and what I shall want to call its deformed aspirational politics. We see a popularized and powerful form in Myrdal's 1944 work, An American Dilemma, The Negro Problem in Modern Democracy, and in that work, Myrdal deploys liberalism's commitment to freedom, equal regard, and social justice to address racial inequality. From the 1940s to the 1960s, racial liberalism shaped social, legal, economic, and political engineering in the United States. Myrdal is a representative example of a way of thinking about the country's history of racial discrimination and its quest to realize a just society. In An American Dilemma, I want to say, we find a once-born liberalism with little place for sin and tragedy. To speak about him as I do is to get at his aspirational politics and the underlying attitude informing his vision. It is an attitude of evasion. It is the very same attitude that is with us today. Against the backdrop of Myrdal, I focus on one of the most critical responses of the period, the thinking of James Baldwin. His writings captured the public imagination and shamed the political establishment as the Black freedom struggle was coming into view in the early 60s. I turn to Baldwin because in him we find a constrained aspirational politics, born as it was from seeing both the promises and betrayals of the United States. In his writings, we discover his confrontation with the irrevocable deeds of white supremacy, and yet the necessity of responding to it all the same, because at last we are responsible for the communities to which we belong. To call it white supremacy irrevocable is to focus on the soul-scarring character of white supremacy, for which, as Baldwin says, quote, neither he nor time nor history will ever forgive, end quote. So I reach for Baldwin in these Trumpian times because I think his attention to the scarred soul of the nation gives us a better understanding of things I hope we still care about, even if we are confused about how to understand them today. Things such as our history in the United States, ideas such as responsibility and atonement. If Myrdal offers us an attitude of evasion that is still with us, Baldwin offers us an attitude in which we must be critically responsive to history. Being critically responsive, I hope to persuade you today, comes with a great deal more than what Myrdal offers. So we'll begin with Myrdal, we'll conclude with Baldwin, and along the way we'll meet a cast of characters. So Myrdal's An American Dilemma represents a major statement on race and inequality when it was published in 1944. The Carnegie Corporation commissioned the study in 1938 because they doubted that Americans could be or would be objective regarding the matter. We were, for the Carnegie Corporation, too close. So they selected the Swedish economist Myrdal, who had already established himself as a social theorist, as an economist, most importantly. And he in turn enlisted some of the most gifted scholars of race in the fields of history, sociology, economics, and political science. In the study, Myrdal embraces a specific kind of moralism latent in American culture. He opens and closes the massive study, well over 1,000 pages, by framing the problem of racial inequality in terms of the crisis of moral commitment among white Americans and their betrayal of what he calls the American creed. This remains the most enduring part of the study. The politics of the day and for several decades thereafter also drew support from the study. The framing of any book, including this one, matters. It matters a great deal. Myrdal's decision to structure the book in the way he did shapes how we ought to understand the underlying ideological commitments of the United States, the history of racial disregard, and the status of white Americans in addressing the problem. The book aspires to tell an origin story about who Americans are. And origin stories are very interesting kinds of things. Origin stories are often determinative. They have, as Edward Said tells us, a divine, mythical, and privileged character that dominates what is derived from it. Origin stories are about fate. We don't need to spend too much time referencing comic books, but they're useful for a moment. You try to escape your origin story. You try as a hero to become a villain into a hero, and you'll be penalized. It's inescapable. The origin story settles existential questions about who one is, what one's purpose is, and allows you to push to the side those things that are not relevant. I don't want to go too far with the analogy, but I do want to suggest that the origin story for Miral is functioning in a similar kind of way. And so it is not surprising then that in the very first chapter, he says, we must begin, quote, with the origin of the American creed. Behind racial inequality in the United States, he wants us to believe we discover a true community that beckons us, a vision of American identity in its pure form. That pure identity is one that is committed to freedom and equal regard, a creed that says everyone is worthy of respect and the opportunity to chart their own course so long as it is consistent with the ability of others to do the same. The pure form of American identity and Miral's religious belief that American democracy is fated to win the battle against white supremacy brings to my mind William James's classic account of the once born soul. Here's our first character. Why reach for James? I want to suggest that the heuristic of the once born soul best captures Miral's brand of liberalism. Heuristics are mental shortcuts that economize our thinking, and when they are about the world, they declutter the landscape, but they can often be too neat. They can clean up the landscape too much, and that is the problem. I'm suggesting that the American creed declutters the landscape, and behind it, the kind of figure that is behind it is this once-born soul. In his Varieties of Religious Experience of 1902, James distinguishes between two ideal types, the once-born and twice-born souls. He acknowledges that most of us are of a mixed variety, but what is of significance is that these different types of souls embody different attitudes toward life. The firstborn has a healthy-minded attitude and often, I quote here, looks on all things and sees that they are good, end quote. In the systematic variety, James continues, of healthy-mindedness, it selects one aspect of the world as its essence for the time being and disregards the other aspects, end quote. In order to resist humanity's constant struggle and violation of its own highest image, the once-born consistently retreats to a positive feature of human nature and claims that feature as the most enduring part of human nature. In contrast, James says the twice-born soul sees both the light and the persistence of the dark features of human nature. Quote, the doctrine of the twice-born holds as it does more of the element in solution is the completer view. James's point is not that the once-born soul cannot acknowledge evil, but it factors as an anomaly in human life, and thus the once-born is prevented from accepting evil as a durable feature of human nature. As he says of the once-born, quote, the world is a sort of one-storied affair whose accounts are kept in one denomination, whose parts have just the value which naturally they appear to have, end quote. The once born, he says later, lives on the plus side of life. The textual echo of the once born lives in an American dilemma, but to notice it, we must track Miron's description of the problem. In the introduction, he captures the heart of the issue. Here is Miron. The American Negro is a problem in the heart of the American. It is there that the interracial tension has its focus. It is there that the decisive struggle goes on. This is a central viewpoint of this treatise. At bottom, our problem is a moral dilemma of the American, the conflict between his moral valuations on various levels of consciousness. What does that mean? Throughout the book, Miron insists that white Americans are pulled in two different directions. On the one hand, they believe in freedom and equality, which he says defines the American creed. And on the other, there are a variety of prejudices against African Americans that he says betrays the creed. For Miron, each white American carries within their breast this tension, and it dogs their psyche and wreaks havoc on the external community in which African Americans live out their lives. But despite this description, Miron maintains, he insists, that the American creed, and here now I quote him, is the morally higher and truer value that directs political society. This is Miron isolating what he takes to be the essence of the American polity, as the once born often does. He treats the history of racial domination as an aberration within American life, and thus set about the task of educating the citizenry to their true commitments. Miron partitions the past between those features that truly convey American ideals and those that reflect anomalies within the national identity. This is why he says, quote, in principle, the Negro problem was settled long ago. Well, what does that mean? For him, the scope of freedom was clear. The conditions of equality were properly understood, but the application was limited. Miron's text is not merely descriptive. It articulates a normative aspiration. His elevated notion of our national identity in the United States, even today, you can hear it. It whispers to our soul like ministering angels, and it comforts the heart. So it is not unsurprising that an American dilemma became a text not only for the academic, but for the layperson as well, as abridged versions of the text were produced for policymaker and student alike in the 50s and well into the 60s. An American dilemma is filled with examples, both interpersonal and structural, of white supremacy and Black domination. So there's a kind of contextual sensitivity throughout the text. But these examples inhabit the text in a particular way and shape how the nation should think about its identity amid racial disregard. Ultimately, narrating the American dilemma works by fragmenting not what we remember, but how we remember it. The past flows away from us into the gutter of our horrible deeds, giving us the impression that they form no part of our shared identity, that they do not, in fact, touch the nation's soul. The details of the past are called forth and seemingly shape the present, but Miron sequesters them, allowing Americans to say in the 1940s, as Americans so often say today, that's not who we are. He encourages his readers to take comfort that the vision of life on display in the 1940s is not theirs. He sanctions the thought that the prejudices that constrain Black life are not also of America's will. Ever on the quest for an unsullied political identity, Miron ironically deforms our way of seeing the full picture of our humanity. And in that deformation, he leaves us less than human, less responsive to our shared, even if tragic, inheritance, and less attuned as a result to the sources of racial injustice. At precisely this moment, we can hear, I think, James Baldwin's worry. 2 decades later, in his 1964 essay, The White Problem. Here's Baldwin. What is most terrible is that American white men are not prepared to believe my version of the story in order to avoid believing that they have set up in themselves a fantastic system of evasions, denials, and justifications, a system that is about to destroy their grasp of reality, which is another way of saying their moral sense, end quote. When Baldwin talks about the system of evasions, he often talks about it as Americans' insistence on their innocence. Innocence is a term that Baldwin uses throughout his work. He uses innocence to diagnose America's refusal to face its racial history. Innocence for Baldwin denotes an attitude, a point of view, which, as he says, infuses the cultural field of the United States and shapes the outlook of a great many white Americans, he insists. Innocence involves, he tells us, closing one's eyes to others and their historical particularity, the people in front of you with a distinct biography, to affirm an alternative and false reality. What precisely is that false reality? Well, he names it now, thinking about the nation. In that same essay of 1964, here's Baldwin. The people who settled the country had a fatal flaw. They could recognize a man when they saw one. They knew he wasn't anything else but a man. But since they were Christian, and since they had already decided that they came here to establish a free country, the only way to establish the role this chattel was playing in one's life was to say that he was not a man. If he wasn't, then no crime had been committed. That lie is the basis of our present troubles. You see the preoccupation with innocence here? We'll come back to this language of fatal flaw because we're going to have to figure out what that amounts to. But for the moment, I think what's important about this passage is that Baldwin detects the attitude of evasion. To confront Black pain and death involves acknowledging something about one's community. Acknowledgement shatters illusions. Something that Baldwin argues is a difficult, even if necessary, thing for society to do. And here is the difficulty. Quote, the danger, he tells his nephew in The Fire Next Time, in the minds of most white Americans is the loss of their identity. Try to imagine how you would feel if you woke up one morning to find the sun shining and all the stars aflame. Any upheaval in the universe is terrifying because it so profoundly attacks one's sense of reality, end quote. I'll just put in parenthetical that if one were to think about 2019 in the United States, 2019, 2021, and think about the replacement theory that was in circulation in circles on the right, but that achieved broad-based a conversation and reflection, the idea that there's some grand conspiracy to displace white Americans. That is sort of the contemporary version of what Baldwin is talking about. Behind this remark is Baldwin's ongoing confrontation with identity as a form of estrangement and deformation. If he tries to enable Black people to see their white counterparts, he also seeks to describe to white Americans the illusions that grip them and the cost. So his preoccupation with identity is also a call for his fellows to be suspicious of who they take themselves to be. Estrangement is about how the meaning of American identity evades the reality of historical inheritance. What do I mean by that? When white Americans narrate the meaning of the Civil War, Reconstruction, the Civil Rights Movement, or even today, the election of the first African-American president, these stories function as instances of the moral commitment of the nation, writing the course of events. What is implicit becomes explicit in those critical moments, because that's who we really are. These moments in American history are not interpreted, as Baldwin would encourage us to do, as deep criticisms of and tensions within the complicated identity of the nation. And for that reason, the nation does not interpret those moments as departures from the founders' commitments. They do not, in other words, show us a scarred nation attempting to be born again. Deformation, I've spent some time with estrangement, deformation of our ethical capacities, what Baldwin called the moral sense, results from estrangement. He argues that the intensity of one's attachment to the innocence of American life matches the ease with which one abdicates responsibility for the communities to which one belongs. People who imagine, he writes a year later in 1965, the white man's guilt, that history flatters them, impaled on their history like a butterfly on a pin, and become incapable of seeing or changing themselves or the world. Our ethical capacities matter not merely because they make us attuned to the world, but also because we find our ability to remake the world in that very attunement. What does that really mean? Part of what Baldwin is suggesting when he talks about ethical capacities, what he's really talking about is our perceptual abilities, our ability to sort of see and hear and feel the pain of others. But if you have now deformed, right? If you are estranged from the actual persons in front of you, the history that's in front of you, then your ethical capacities will be responding either to the wrong kind of problem or not responding at all. There's a striking implication Baldwin asks his readers to consider that tells a different story about the political goals of the United States. As a form of estrangement, American identity evades democratic freedom. His picture of freedom isn't novel. From the 1830s through the 1950s, African Americans pushed against practices of domination, but they also tried to get the nation to embrace what we might call a non-sovereign view of freedom. In essence, freedom requires cultural and institutional support, and thus requires one to be seen or taken in a certain way by one's community to complete one's freedom. The ability to pursue one's life plans without fear or threat of being subjected to the use of arbitrary power requires that you belong to a community that believes and is willing to fight for your right to pursue that plan of life without fear of arbitrary power. We are, in a common sense way, inescapably dependent on each other to realize freedom. But dependency involves vulnerability, potentially revealing the inadequacies or the limitations of the identities on which we rely. However, necessary freedom turns out to be a hard thing to bear for those that claim they are innocent. Here is the rub, I think, and however obvious it may seem, we in the United States must never tire of saying it and encouraging each other to accept its truth. The things to which one must attend do not disappear because we shut our eyes, and the inherited costs display themselves in the form of reinscribed harms that will continue to demand a response. This point of view gives us a different take on the narration of American history. Reconstruction, the Civil Rights Movement, or even Black Power were not merely sites of transformative possibilities, but the manifestation of repressed trauma haunting the present, demanding a response. You all okay?
Yeah.
All right. So what do we do? For Baldwin, nothing short of a rebirth is required, a reawakening by embracing the nation's trauma as also what the nation is. Baldwin's plea is that Americans assume a different attitude, critically embrace their past, and allow both to structure a collective vision of responsibility. But just as Meadow's view involved a picture of innocence against which Baldwin railed, I want to suggest that Meadow's view also involved a narrow conception of responsibility inadequate to the fullness of history. And of course, the argument here is that Baldwin offers us more. But to see it, I want to take you to a scene in American history. Here we meet a couple more characters. Before an audience in 1963, Baldwin, the American sociologist Nathan Glazer, the American philosopher Sidney Hook, and Meadall gathered for Commentaries Magazine Symposium, Liberalism and the Negro. 1963, it's a roundtable discussion with a live audience. This would then subsequently be published. Commentary, which still exists, is a monthly magazine founded by the American Jewish Committee in 1945, quite popular and important by the 1960s. By the 1970s, it begins a shift toward neoconservatism. The symposium was subsequently published in 1964, marking the 20th anniversary of Meadall's 1944 study. The symposium took stock of America's progress on the nation's most significant dilemma. And one immediately notices that Baldwin stands apart from America's liberal defenders. The focal point of tension, though, is not between Baldwin and Meadall, which you might have anticipated given how I started. It's not the focal point of attention, at least not explicitly. And it's not between Baldwin and Glazer, which historians like to talk about a great deal. The heart of the disagreement is between Baldwin and Hook. And just as a parenthetical, if you have any sense of like Hook and Dewey, this is really ironic that would be the focal point of the tension. So behind Hook's critical engagement with Baldwin is a broader concern about the role of history in thinking about ethical and political life. Hook tells the audience that the ethical principles of American life, by which he means the Declaration of Independence, must guide society. And he concedes there is much to do to improve the life chances of African Americans, but he insists there's little doubt that the nation has made and will continue to make progress. And then he directs his ire toward Baldwin. To argue otherwise about the nation and its progress, as he claims Baldwin does, is, quote, to paralyze our ethical impulses. Throughout the exchange, Hook seems more consistent with Meadall than Meadall himself. Mm-hmm. Hook leans into an ideological defense of liberal democracy that is indistinguishable from his appreciation of America, of the United States, as an ethical republic. To him, Baldwin looked more like the social protest novelist Richard Wright, and Hook had already criticized him and others in 1949 for pushing unsavory views about the United States. This ideological context and Hook's politics of vindication shaped his attitude toward the past and thinking about racial justice and his account of responsibility. Here is Sidney Hook. Those people in the South are not responsible for the initial acts which develop the situation in which they find themselves. They can be charged with responsibility for not playing a greater role, for not taking a more active part in the political process. But there's a tremendous difference between responsibility for a problem, which we run away from, and collective guilt for the crimes of races. Now, I want you to observe two things about this passage. The first, as Hook says elsewhere, he conceives of the Negro problem, his language, as a problem for Black people that is in need of being fixed by those with whom they share society. But this gives a specific character to the issue at hand. The problem inheres in the condition of African Americans. After all, it is the Negro problem. And thus Hook takes the background conditions for granted. We do not, in other words, treat the problem as a feature of the historical development of American institutions and as something for which we must take responsibility. And this leads into the second observation. In Hook's thinking, we can discern the outline of what one scholar refers to as the liability model of responsibility. We must be able to assign culpability to agents causally tied to consequences for which responsibility is sought. In other words, we need to be able to identify that it emanated from your will. This leads him to suggest in the passage above, they were racist then, we are not now, and our responsibility extends no further than the actions we in the present have committed. History remains, but its role is diminished, lest we endanger human agency and social transformation. If the American creed is a once-born faith because it has little space for lasting anguish and little patience for the specters of the past, Baldwin's account is very different. Baldwin argues that the way to a new America must run through the trauma of Black life, a twice-born faith in James's sense that does not remit the nation's failures, but holds both promises and betrayals clearly in view. Baldwin famously alerts us to this in the Fire Next Time, which I briefly referred to at the outset of the lecture, not by name. This line can find no home in Hooke's 1963 remarks. Quote, this is Baldwin. This is the crime of which I accuse my country and my countrymen, and for which neither I nor time nor history will ever forgive, that they have destroyed and are destroying hundreds of thousands of Black lives. Destruction not only happened, but it continues anew. Destruction is happening today. To speak as he does indicates that Baldwin is not merely interested in us recalling past events. It is not a question of memory, he says in 1955. The man does not remember the hand that struck him, the darkness that frightened him as a child. Nevertheless, the hand and the darkness remain with him, indivisible from himself forever, part of the passion that drives him whenever he takes flight, whenever he seeks the light. To stand in an intimate relationship with the past requires us to acknowledge how it shapes the ground of our identity and the practical judgments that work themselves into the world through our words and our deeds. The foundational role Baldwin accords the past is likely to make a great many Americans nervous. There's a kind of Old Testament sensibility in his writings and how the failures of the past come to weigh on the present. And worries over guilt or blame swirl about us in the United States when asked to see ourselves as responsible for the past. In our contemporary moment, I am reminded of Republican Senator Mitch McConnell's response to reparations for slavery in 2019. Quote, I don't think reparations for something that happened 150 years ago, for whom none of us currently living are responsible, is a good idea. For a society preoccupied with innocence and that thinks of responsibility always through the liability model, Baldwin will appear to be asking us to take the fall for something we did not do and over which we exercise no control. We heard it in Hooke, this worry, and Baldwin's famous exchange with the cultural anthropologist Margaret Mead in the 1970s, you can hear it again. Baldwin asked Mead to think about our connection to each other across time and how our past may bind us. And to that suggestion, she responds, quote, well, I think if you take that position, it's absolutely hopeless. I will not accept any guilt for what anybody else did. I will accept guilt for what I did myself. The reason, she continues, if we cannot control it, we're not guilty. Now, despite Baldwin's claims, he's not interested in blame or guilt. I'm not interested in anybody's guilt, he says in 1964. I know you didn't do it and I didn't do it either. To Mead's concerns directly, he says, but I'm not trying to make us guilty. Similar to Hooke and Mead, Baldwin is after responsibility, but it is not of the liability kind. But I'm responsible for it, he continues, because I am a man and a citizen of this country, and you're responsible for it too. The it here is obviously the racial nightmare in the United States. At just this moment, I think Baldwin's insights shine through, but it requires us to go back to that connection that I drew between freedom and dependency a bit earlier. Freedom denotes dependency, the necessity of a kind of socio-institutional ecology that creates ethical and political conditions for us to complete our freedom. In that case, the lack of a healthy ecosystem that produces and reproduces injustices will prevent freedom's realization. For Baldwin, we should not think of this as merely a structural institutional problem, because reproduction also lives in us, in our habits and our sensibilities. When these institutions are at work, they create an environment of identity formation that also bears our stamp. They reflect and reproduce who we are. The reproduction of racial injustice across time requires a corresponding capacious idea of responsibility to match. What Baldwin is after in his time, I think we find nicely stated by Iris Marion Young in our own. I noticed that some of y'all were looking for this. Y'all noticed some of those earlier moves. Quote, shared responsibility is a responsibility I personally bear, but I do not bear it alone. I bear it in the awareness that others bear it with me. Acknowledgement of my responsibility is also acknowledgement of the inchoate collective of which I am a part, which together produces injustices. Our racial history thus requires that we view responsibility as something we can share, even when we cannot causally see it flowing from our will. So Baldwin thinks we awaken our responsibility by holding the nightmare in view. Hooke suggests otherwise. Hooke thinks the American creed can only survive by releasing it from its burdens. And this is what a great many of us in the United States are talking about today. There's no way to explain the book banning in Florida and Texas and other places without it reminding you of this desire to unburden the American creed. Hooke and Mill were uninterested in asking the questions that Baldwin thought we must ask. How should we stand to the irrevocable deeds of white supremacy? What is the fate of responsibility in a democratic society given the brutal racial history of the United States? What is left of aspirational politics that the past always haunts the present? So let me now begin to sort of draw this to a close, keeping these questions in view. There is, I think, a lingering issue, and it has to do with the weightiness of our history. And it comes in the form of the very notion of an irrevocable deed that I mentioned at the very outset of the talk. For if deeds are irrevocable and their consequences seem to extend into the present, it's not clear why one would ever attempt to respond. One might worry that how Baldwin asks us to think about the past threatens to endanger the very notion of aspirational politics, given the weight of history. His claim in The Fire Next Time that the country's crimes against Black people are something for which he, nor time, nor history can ever forgive, or his insistence in The White Problem that the act of enslavement was the country's fatal flaw, may seem to deny transformation and progress. The reason we in the United States are likely to think this is because of how we historically envision our politics. But if aspirational politics holds out the possibility of change and progress where racial justice is concerned, it must be because the nation can redeem itself through its politics. Progress, we so often think, must imply, at least in the United States, must imply salvation. Well, I ask you to think about the matter differently. To take Baldwin seriously requires us to disentangle transformation and progress talk from redemption talk. This is not a tactic and it isn't a program. It isn't a policy. It is an attitude or mood that nurtures and tries to sustain the citizenry for an incomplete and, dare I say, perhaps incompletable journey. I don't think, Baldwin says in that roundtable discussion to Sidney Hooke, I don't think we can discuss the ethical character of the nation properly unless we begin at the beginning, end quote. When he asks us to return to the beginning, here's our final character. When he asks us to return to the beginning and the weightiness of our past, he asks us to think of the nation as Josiah Royce once thought of an individual that wrecked their moral universe. Here is how Royce put it in that extraordinary text of 1913, The Problem of Christianity. Here's Royce. In his own deed, he has been false to whatever light he then and there had, and to whatever ideal he then viewed as his highest good. Hereupon no new deed, however good or however faithful and however much of worthy consequences, it introduces into the future life of the traitor or of his world, can annul the fact that the one traitorous deed was actually done. For Baldwin, the deeds are the enslavement of Black people in the corresponding hierarchy of value we call white supremacy. He cannot absolve white Americans of a deformation they initiated in the nation's name. And this point holds even as Baldwin often encourages Black people, his nephew in particular, to, quote, accept them with love. Baldwin asks his Black audiences to love white people, but he also thinks this goes a long way in unburdening Black people with the responsibility for saving their white counterparts. Love, as we know, is powerful, and it always requires partners, especially civic love. The love from Black people may point the way to accepting one's past, and is therefore important to that extent, but until, quote, they understand their history, they cannot be released from, end quote. Time and history cannot serve in that role either, although they are useful in making the temporal distance or marking the temporal distance from one's beginning. They cannot dissolve the inherited consequences of those actions. To be released from the past or forgiven for it, these mean the same thing in Baldwin's writings, is not the same as absolving one of the horrors that the past represent in time. In his conversation with Mead, he refers to this as the dynamic that exists in time. Those deeds are irrevocable, and they seeded the ethical and political life we now live. To this thought, Mead recoils. Then we've nowhere to go, she says. And it would appear that we have run into a problem, because it now appears that Baldwin has seemingly traded in one origin story for another, that in abandoning the optimism of the American creed, he has embraced a kind of pessimism. No, Baldwin says, because, quote, we have atonement. To atone is to engage in reparative work. It orients the soul as one undertakes the work of correction, of improvement, of development. An atoning community looks backward to the beginning that has given life to the harms, is perceptually attuned to how the harms ripple through time, and engages in ameliorative actions so that those in the future may live more humanely in the light of their past. In this way, atonement gives a specific meaning to our present actions in redressing social inequalities, racial inequalities that contrast with the language of redemption. Redemption, in contrast, would aim to restore that which was broken and deliver us from the harms that follow as a result. To take the classic example, redeemed through Christ, is to be delivered from one's sins. Christ on the cross is a powerful and rich image. It represents the emptying of the self in the form of sacrifice for humanity, thus releasing us from our sins. Baldwin, throughout all of his writings, never invoked Christ in this role to respond to America's racial history. There is no narrative of escape, no redeemer, no metaphysical certainty guaranteed to us by our origin story. And with this, Baldwin dispenses with redemption, and we in the United States must do the same. It will give our democratic aspirations a more realistic grounding. As it stands now, our quest for national absolution through our politics is absolutely destructive. It leads us to attach too much value to victories of racial progress and to read historical successes as redemption. It encourages us to believe it is permissible to monetize and materialize the reparative work of atonement. It deforms our relationship to history, leading us to believe that to study the past of slavery and racial injustice is to terrorize rather than to empower young Black and white children as part of a practice of civic transformation. It obscures that reparations, for example, is an ongoing, never-ending struggle of bending the nation's will toward freedom and equality. And this preoccupation with redemption blinds us to the fact that responding to our racial history, similar to living our democracy, depends on what Baldwin says are choices, quote, we have got to make forever and ever and ever, every day, end quote. To be sure, white supremacy is for him America's sin. The source of the sin is historical, not metaphysical, and is rooted in this worldly choices. Still, sin talk has symbolic power. Sin illuminates a form of wrongdoing that cuts deep, that not only touches the soul, but has a hand in the soul's formation. If our history of racial disregard lives in us, Baldwin insists that it follows that even our affirmative confrontation with it only makes sense because we embrace the past. Or to put it differently, Our affirmative gestures of redress, whether they're legal or political, are only intelligible because they bear the trace of a stain we have inherited. We can atone for our racial crimes, but even through our reparative work, we are reminded of the fatal betrayal of the fatal flaw. And to assume this point of view involves, I think, a radical transformation and a knowledge of it, if I may put it that way, of this point of view, has helped me in my thinking. This point of view envisions a society struggling to remain alive to the dangers of its racial past, to be perceptually on alert to how it might display itself in time. And this is why Baldwin describes our confrontation with our past as a battle. We do not find success, though, in defeating the past, but in preventing it, as he says, from becoming tyrannical. Being alive to our beginnings may permit us to begin again, wounds and all. This process, Baldwin insists, is community work, the hard work of democracy, and it can, for the citizens of the United States, also serve as the darkened light of their faith, forged through the tragedy of their history as they continue the ongoing struggle of responding to racial injustice. Thank you.